Okay, we might as well get going then. So I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar on assessing company performance on deforestation, and looking specifically at the 2022 Forest 500 methodology. My name is Josh Brewer. I'm the Sustainable Finance Associate here at Global Canopy, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. And I've got an absolutely fantastic panel alongside me today. So I'm joined by Jeff Milder, who's Director of Global Policy and Coalitions at the Rainforest Alliance and Director of the Backbone Team of the Accountability Framework Initiative. Hi, Jeff. I'm joined by Sarah Draper, who's Corporate Performance Lead at Global Canopy. Hi, Sarah. And by Emma Thompson, who's the Forest 500 Manager for Global Canopy. So just looking at our agenda today, I'm just going to run through a little bit of a welcome and some housekeeping, and then we'll have a sort of introduction and kind of broader context from Jeff, and then move on to looking at what is Forest 500 more generally from Sarah, and then sort of arrowing in on the methodology with Emma at the end, and then we'll finish off with a Q&A session. So just to put this webinar into a little bit of context, we go out to companies, we ask them to be transparent. And so we felt it was only fair that we're transparent about the way we assess those companies. And this webinar is part of that process of just being open about our assessment process and our methodology. So before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping. So this session is being recorded. We're going to share that recording with you afterwards. And as I've noted, there is a Q&A session at the end. If you could please put questions into the Q&A box rather than the chat box, and then we'll collect those up and then we'll be able to work through those with the panel towards the end. Okay, so first up, we'll hear from Jeff Milder, who will give an introduction to collective efforts on addressing deforestation in supply chain. Over to you, Jeff.
Great, thank you very much, Josh, and good morning, good afternoon to all. Can you hear me okay? Wonderful. Well, it's great to be here. Just briefly on myself and the initiative that I represent. I direct the Accountability Framework Initiative, the AFI, which is a collaborative effort to create a new normal where the production and trade of agricultural and forestry commodities are free from deforestation, conversion, and human rights violations. Global Canopy has been a close partner of ours for several years as we embark on this work. So I'm really happy to be able to share some brief context for the Forest 500 initiative and for the methodology. May I have the next slide, please? So in terms of context, I think it's helpful to begin with what we see as the objective here, why we're doing this work in the first place. And from our standpoint, the aim is to make supply chains, deforestation-free and responsible supply chains, business as usual. And in order to do that, and this is true of really any broad shift in business or policy that takes place in our society, this shift needs to be supported by clear expectations, clear rules of the game, and also by clear accountability that incentivizes the kind of performance and progress that we're hoping to see. The reason why we launched the AFI back in 2017 is that these expectations and these accountability mechanisms around deforestation and free and responsible supply chains were not at that time very well aligned. So you had different environmental NGOs and different industry groups coming forward with different standards, different expectations, even different definitions of what we meant by deforestation. And then on the accountability side, there was an array of different scorecards that were all using different criteria to assess company performance. So you actually had situations where the same company might be awarded an A by one scorecard and a C or an F by another scorecard for their management of palm oil sourcing. And this created a lot of ambiguity for companies. And clearly it wasn't conducive to the aim of scaling up progress and good practices toward eliminating deforestation from supply chains. So our work over the past few years has been to foster greater clarity and much stronger alignment, both for the expectations placed on companies for how they transform their supply chains, and among the different disclosure systems and reporting standards that exist in the space as well. So if you could click to the next animation here, please. And what we mean by this is that the set of expectations and guidelines for companies are internally aligned between the different kinds of organizations that are putting those forward. The metrics and criteria for assessing company performance are also internally aligned. And then there's mutual alignment between the two, so that when companies are being asked to do certain things, those are in fact the things that they're being then evaluated on. And of course, there's many players in this space. So when we talk about alignment, this isn't just a matter of, say, Greenpeace asking the same thing as WWF. It also implicates industry and sector initiatives. It implicates what financial institutions are asking their business partners to do in terms of managing deforestation risk. Increasingly, it also implicates government regulators, for instance, with the new EU legislative proposal on deforestation. And so our aim with the AFI and with our partners is to help foster this clarity and alignment so that we can begin to shift toward a business as usual around this common set of guidelines and common accountability. Next slide, please. So central to our work is consensus building. And for this reason, the AFI is really led by a broad coalition. Our core coalition is civil society organizations. These organizations, as you can see here, broadly represent both environmental and human rights perspectives. They include both global perspectives and organizations from tropical countries that are trying to address deforestation and commodity issues on the ground. And our consensus building work extends beyond just civil society to include industry associations, companies, multi-stakeholder initiatives, and others. Next, please. So the central resource that we provide for helping to foster this clarity and alignment is called the Accountability Framework. And you can think about the Accountability Framework as a roadmap for ethical supply chains. And the scope of this framework focuses on halting deforestation, halting conversion of other natural ecosystems, and ensuring full respect for human rights. These topics, of course, also have important ramifications for other key ESG issues that companies are working on, such as greenhouse gas emissions from land use change, which companies are now being asked to set goals and report on as part of their Scope 3 emissions accounting for supply chains or their Scope 1 emissions accounting for their own operations. Next. And so looking in a bit more detail about the accountability framework, it provides, the roadmap covers 3 stages of action, setting commitments or goals, implementing these commitments, and then demonstrating progress through reporting and disclosure. So we have a document called the Core Principles, which provides in concise form the expectations and good practices around each of these. And these are supported by detailed operational guidance, which goes into considerable detail around questions like, what are the different methods for traceability that companies may use? Or what are the expectations for ensuring that new commodity production sites are established in accordance with deforestation-free and land rights principles? There's also a companion to the framework, which is a set of metrics that are used for disclosure and assessment related to these same practices. We call this the common methodology, and it's being used right now by most of the relevant disclosure systems, reporting standards, and assessment initiatives in the space, including Forest 500, but also others that you probably recognize, such as CDP, Global Reporting Initiative, World Benchmarking Alliance, SPOT, and WWF's Commodity Scorecard, among others. So again, our aim here really is to foster clear and consistent expectations and guidelines for companies around deforestation and free and responsible supply chains, and then to marry this with a fair and objective set of accountability mechanisms that reward companies that are making progress, and in doing so can help catalyze a broader shift toward deforestation-free becoming business as usual. So looking forward to hearing a bit more detail about how some of these ideas are reflected in the new Forest 500 methodology. And with that, let me pass it back to you, Josh. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. That's really useful to get that overview of where the Forest 500 sits and also the kind of wider framework for accountability. So Sarah, if I could cross over to you now, and you could just give us a bit of the background on Forest 500, what it is and what it does.
Absolutely, thanks, Josh. So Forest 500 started in 2014 to hold companies and financial institutions accountable to their voluntary deforestation commitments. It was around that time that we were seeing more and more commitments coming from companies and institutions. They're signing up to collective agreements, such as the New York Declaration on Forests, which was signed in 2014 and aimed to eliminate deforestation from commodity supply chains by 2020 as one of its goals. But also the Consumer Goods Forum members committed to work together to achieve zero net deforestation by 2020. They signed that in 2010. And then again in 2014, signatories to the Banking Environment Initiative's Soft Commodities Compact committed to helping those Consumer Goods Forum companies in their goal. So we set up the Forest 500 to start to bring accountability to companies exposed to deforestation and track how they're doing against these global goals of tackling deforestation linked to commodity production. Forest 500 first identifies and then ranks the most important players in supply chains linked to deforestation. 350 companies and 150 financial institutions that have the greatest influence on tropical deforestation, as identified by their exposure to deforestation risk. As we now know, those 2020 goals were missed, so we have continued to track these key players and think it's really important to keep doing so. Forest 500 is funded by the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office and previously the Department for International Development. Next slide, please. We select the Forest 500 every 2 years, and we start by identifying the 350 companies. To inform our selection of the companies, we first identify the tropical countries with the greatest forest loss since 2010. And in our 2022 selection, the countries we've identified represent 96% of tropical deforestation. We then look at the countries importing the largest value of each forest risk commodity in the most recent 2 years. And then we come up with a list of key producing and trading countries for these commodities, which then guides our selection of key companies. Next slide, please. We use that list of countries to guide our identification of the biggest players in the supply chains of palm oil, soy, cattle products, so beef and leather, and timber products, including pulp and paper. All companies are selected to be in the Forest 500 based on their exposure and their role in the supply chains of at least one of these 6 commodities, but they're then assessed for any of the 6 commodities that they are exposed to through their supply chains. Next slide, please. We select companies at each stage of the supply chain as well. So we have companies at the producer level all the way through to traders and right down to retailers. We do use different data and metrics depending on which commodity and segment of the supply chain we're looking at. This is partly due to data availability, but also due to their different roles. So it can include metrics like land bank area owned, market share of particular industries or relevant markets, or even volume of the commodity that passes through them. Our selection is reviewed every other year to ensure that we capture any changes in the markets and continue to include the most influential power brokers within our assessments. And this year we've identified 26 new companies, which we've added to our assessments for this year, including companies across all of the 6 commodities that we're looking at. Next slide, please. Once we've identified those 350 companies, we then look at their financing and identify the 150 financial institutions that provide the most finance to those companies through shareholdings, loans and underwritings, or bond holdings. Next slide, please. Due to their broad exposure to different sectors and also exposure indirectly through other financial institutions, all of the 150 financial institutions are assessed for palm oil, soy, cattle products, and timber products. Again, this selection is reviewed every other year to ensure we capture any changes in the financing of their key companies and continue to track those financial institutions with the greatest influence over those companies. So once we have our selection of 500 organizations, Global Canopy assesses each of the 350 companies and 150 financial institutions annually on the strength and implementation of their commitments and policies on deforestation and associated social issues, which we will cover in much more detail in a bit, but back to you, Josh.
Thanks, Sarah. I think what we might do is we've just had a couple of questions come in, so we might just take a little break and just work through those questions. So the first one that we've got here is, and Jeff, I think this is probably one for you, is when assessing performance against deforestation using a framework like the AFI, what would be the assurance standard to be used against? Would it be ISAE 3000 using limited assurance, or would it be another standard?
Great, yeah, thanks for that question. So the Accountability Framework Initiative doesn't include a verification mechanism and doesn't provide verification oversight. So we do ask companies to disclose progress on their progress toward eliminating deforestation and other in-scope issues via their own sustainability report and or reporting into platforms such as CDP. And for information that they disclose through their sustainability report, having that verified through an appropriate mechanism is something we also recommend. So in that regard, ISAE 3000, a standard like that would be an appropriate one to use. But the AFI itself is not prescriptive about that, and we don't oversee that.
Thanks for that, Jeff. And then just maybe another, I suppose, broader question here, and if I pass this one through to you, Sarah. Why doesn't Forest 500 look at cocoa or coffee, for instance?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you. So we've prioritized the commodities that drive the greatest tropical deforestation globally, simply because we're looking at a defined number of companies, and so we do need to prioritize what we're looking at. That's not to say cocoa and coffee are significant drivers in certain regions. It's just that on a global level, we've prioritized the 6 commodities that drive the greatest amount of tropical deforestation.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Well, I think at that point we might move on and then just take a little bit of a deeper dive into the methodology itself. So, Emma, would you like to take over and then lead us on that tour, please?
Absolutely, thank you, Josh. And thank you all for joining us today to hear more about the Forest 500 company methodology that we will be using for the 2022 assessment period. As you should know, if you're a company, you would have received an email last week to let you know that you've been selected to be in the Forest 500 this year, and also letting you know that our 2022 assessments have already started. They began about 3 weeks ago and are currently scheduled to be completed in November of this year. Anything that you publish on your website during that time will be taken into account in your assessment. And yeah, I will now go through the assessment in more detail. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. As Sarah mentioned, we assess all 350 companies and 150 financial institutions annually on the strength and the implementation of their commitments on deforestation and associated human rights abuses. We use 2 different methodologies to do this. One for companies, which assesses them on the commitments they've made to limit their exposure to deforestation risk in their supply chains, and one for financial institutions, which assess them on the policies they have in place to require their clients that they finance to address deforestation risk. Both of our methodologies assess against the best practice for the sector, with the company methodology being aligned with the Accountability Framework Initiative's common methodology that Jeff talked about earlier. We first aligned with that common methodology in 2020 and have continued to increase alignment with the broader framework of the Accountability Framework each year. All of our assessments are done using publicly available information. So anything that is published on the websites of the companies or financial institutions is taken into account in our assessments. This year, we will provide all companies and financial institutions with access to a form through which they can inform us of any documents or policies newly published during the assessment period. So between May or now and the end of November. The links shared via that form must be publicly accessible. Any privately reported information will still not be considered in the assessment. If you are a company, you will be sent that form in the coming days via email. We work with a team of language consultants to ensure that assessments are conducted in the native language of the country where the company or financial institution is headquartered. And then each year we publish our entire dataset on our website, which this year will be published in the first quarter of 2023. Here, all of the assessment data will be accessible, everything we collect, including the scores, but also the quotes and links to the documents that are used within the assessment. Next slide, please. Thank you. So onto the content of the assessments themselves. So as you can see on the screen, our methodologies have 4 key sections. We have the overall approach, which looks at the high-level action the company is taking to address deforestation. We have commitment strength or content of commitments, which looks at the strength and scope of commitments on deforestation and traceability. We have associated human rights abuses, which previously was called social considerations, which assesses on whether the company has policies in place to address critical human rights issues in forest risk supply chains. And finally, we have implementation and reporting. While we can't see what's happening on the ground, this section of the methodology looks at how companies are communicating about the implementation of their commitments and whether they're following the best practice processes to ensure effective implementation. Next slide, please. And here you can see the breakdown of these sections and how they add up to make a company's total score in our 2022 assessments. Each company receives a commodity-specific score for each commodity and then also a total score. So as you can see, the overall approach is assessed once per company and is worth 10% of the total score. And then, as we mentioned earlier, companies are assessed for each commodity they're exposed to through their supply chains. So for some of the companies, that might be 1 commodity, or for others, it might be all 6. And for each commodity, we assess companies on the content of their commitments, the strength of commitments, on associated human rights, and then finally, implementation and reporting. This year, a company's score on implementation and reporting represents 56% of their total score, as we shift the focus from setting policies to implementing them effectively. Next slide, please. Thank you. I'm now going to quickly run through some of the indicators that will be included in the 2022 company assessment methodology. I will not be going through all of the indicators, but I will be highlighting some of the newly added indicators and also some of the highest scoring indicators for each section of our methodology. Our full methodology will be published on our website. In fact, it already is published on our website, and we will be sharing the link to that document in the chat at the end of this webinar. So starting with the overall approach, as you can see on the screen, this section has a total of 11 indicators in, 3 of which are non-scoring indicators. But as you can see, we're looking for the high-level action that a company is taking to address deforestation. So for instance, looking for an overarching deforestation commitment that covers all of the company's operations. This does not have to be commodity specific, but rather general and applicable to everything that the company does. We also look to see whether the company identifies deforestation as a business risk, whether that is operational, financial, reputational, something that shows that the company, that the company sees that deforestation is a risk to their business. And then we also look for commitments and reporting on greenhouse gas emissions associated with land use change, as well as several other indicators in this section. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then we move on to the commitment strength section. So again, this is assessed once per commodity. This year, we have removed 1 indicator from this section, which was previously only used to assess either palm oil or pulp and paper. The contents of that indicator have now been incorporated into the existing indicator 2.1 that you can see at the top of the screen. And this indicator is looking for the company to have a deforestation commitment. And then we also have indicator 2.2, which looks at companies setting commitments and systems to trace their commodities back to set points in the supply chain. The full scoring details of this indicator are listed in the methodology document, which we will share with you shortly. And yeah, all of the details about the answers and the different steps in the supply chain we're looking for companies to trace back to are in that document. Next slide, please. Thank you. For both of those indicators, we also assess the scope of those commitments. So as you can see, we look to see whether the commitment applies to all of the commodity production or procurement. So identifying whether specific subsidiaries or product lines are excluded, or if that commitment only applies to specific suppliers and specific geographies. If a commitment doesn't cover the full scope of a company's production or sourcing of that commodity, they do score 0 for this indicator. We then also assess whether the company has a target date for the full implementation of that commitment to either deforestation or traceability. And for that indicator, the closer the target date is to 2022, so to now, the higher the company scores for that indicator out of the total points available. And then finally, we also assess whether the commitment has an interim target date, so a stepping stone to achieve the full commitment, which is a really important step for commitments that have a target date that's a bit further away. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then we move on to associated human rights, which was previously called social considerations. This year, we have added one new indicator to this section, but have also made a pre-existing non-scoring indicator scoring. Deforestation is frequently preceded or accompanied by human rights abuses, and so any comprehensive effort to address deforestation must also address human rights abuses. As you can see on the screen, we look for companies to have labour rights commitments that apply to their operations and their supply chains. To score for this indicator, companies have to mention 4 specific rights: the right to have freedom of association and the right to be free from discrimination, forced labour, and child labour. We then also assess if companies commit to test for the free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous peoples and local communities prior to acquiring new interests in land or developments. And we also assess whether the company commits to respect and refrain from land acquisition or developments until any existing conflicts linked to customary rights to land, resources, and territory have been resolved. And then finally, the new indicator that we added this year into this section is on the zero tolerance approach to violence and threats against forest, land, and human rights defenders. Next slide, please. Thank you. So onto the final section of our methodology, which makes up 56% of a company's total score, is the implementation and reporting. This section is slightly different to the previous sections in that some of these indicators are only applicable to upstream companies, so producers and processors, and others only to downstream companies, so traders, manufacturers, and retailers. All indicators in this section add up to the same total score, regardless of whether the company is upstream or downstream. And for all indicators, it is labelled and clearly visible whether they are applicable to all companies, only upstream, or only downstream companies. As you can see, this section includes some indicators focused on reporting on progress of the implementation, like indicator 4.1 and 4.2, and others which focus on the processes in place to implement commitments effectively, like 4.3, which looks at whether companies require suppliers to also be deforestation and or conversion free across all of their operations, or in a new indicator that we added this year, if the company has adopted a jurisdictional approach on sustainable land use in at least one high-risk sourcing region. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is the final slide of the methodology that we'll be going through today, so that there's enough time for any questions at the end. But this is a continuation of some of those implementation and reporting indicators. So what we look for here includes looking for information like what volumes of each commodity is the company producing or using, and that information must have been reported in either 2020, 2021, or 2022. And for indicator 4.19, whether a downstream company reports how many hectares of deforestation or conversion have occurred in their supply chain since a specific reference date, or for upstream companies, whether they report that for the land that they own. And finally, I just wanted to introduce you to 2 of our new implementation indicators focused on human rights. The first, indicator 4.11, focuses on how companies are evidencing that they're implementing their commitments on labour rights and free, prior and informed consent. So looking for things like reporting training given to employees on workers' rights and disclosing how many land developments or site acquisitions by either itself or its suppliers indicated the use of free, prior and informed consent to test for consent prior to acquisition. And the second, indicator 4.12, focuses on how companies are evidencing the implementation of their commitments on the customary rights to land, resources, and territory, and a zero tolerance approach to violence and threats against forest, land, and human rights defenders. So for this indicator, assessors are looking for information like disclosing the process in place for addressing land conflict and the number of forest, land, and human rights defenders threatened or attacked that are linked to land owned, managed, or otherwise controlled by the company or in its supply chain. That is it for me for now, and it's just a focused snippet of our full methodology. And so I'll hand back over to Josh for the Q&A. But as mentioned, our full methodology is now live on forest500.org. We'll post the link in the chat shortly. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Thank you for that clear run through the sort of overview of the methodology there. I'm very pleased to say we've got lots of questions coming in. So I think we'll move across to doing a bit of the question and answer session now. If I could just go to the first one, and I think probably this is one for you, Emma. It's a question coming from Danila. Are companies invited to participate in their assessment, or is the assessment made based on information published just by the company itself?
Thank you. So Forest 500 assessments are based solely on information that the company has published on their website. Transparency is essential in ending deforestation in forest risk supply chains, and we need to see that transparency. We need full information on what a company is doing, how they're exposed to deforestation, and the effectiveness of the implementation of their policies on those issues. So we do only use information that the company has published on their website. We do not engage with the company in terms of requiring information to be fed in to the assessment privately. This year, as I mentioned, we are introducing a new form that everyone will be emailed to notify us of any new documents that have been published on the website that are publicly accessible, which will be used to kind of notify us of new documents that have been published in addition to the checks that we already do. But we do engage with the companies, and once we've finished the assessment, about a week before we publish the assessments live on our website, we will reach out to all of the companies again to notify them of their score, and then also on the day of the launch as well.
Great, thank you. And just a slight follow-up to that, so is third parties' opinion used at all for example, like ESG ratings or those kind of assessments? Is that brought into the assessment methodology?
It would only be brought into the assessment if that has been published on the company's website. The only somewhat exception to that rule is that we do use verified certification reports, specifically from RSPO and RTRS, that are publicly available for specific indicators, such as verification of reporting or reporting volumes of those commodities. But it's only those two indicators, and they're clearly labeled in our methodology. But other than that, unless it's on the company website, we do not include it in our assessment.
Right, thanks, Emma. And so there's a question coming from Igor, which I think is probably going to put across to Jeff, actually. So there are different definitions regarding deforestation according to different country jurisdictions and laws, and also different monitoring institutions may also define their own methodology. For example, clearance above 5 hectares is considered deforestation, and below that is not considered by some assessors. How the Fortune 500 defines Forest 500 defines deforestation. Is there a limit considering the clearance area and how it deals with the different definitions according to each country and region? So maybe, Jeff, if you cover the broader kind of deforestation question, and maybe Sarah, you could come in on the talk about the Forest 500 and how that looks at that part, that piece.
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. I think there's a couple parts to the question here. From the standpoint of the accountability framework, we ask companies to include within their commitments or policies on deforestation a definition of deforestation and deforestation-free, and the accountability framework provides reference definition for both of those terms that we encourage companies to use. Those are generalized global definitions because most companies are sourcing across many different geographies, so it's important to have a common reference point they can use to manage this risk across their whole business. The accountability framework's definition is compatible with many localized definitions. We did that analysis as we were developing the definition. And so where there's a local or national definition that's generally compatible, it may be used. Where there's a government monitoring system that follows a compatible definition, it may also be used. For instance, in Brazil, there are some places, or there could be some places where there's a local definition that isn't compatible. For instance, if a definition just based on where it's legal to deforest, or where land use designations permit deforestation, would not necessarily be compatible with the deforestation-free approach. So companies do need to use a little bit of caution and just make sure they're not referencing a local definition that isn't congruent with the internationally accepted notion of deforestation-free. In terms of the other part of your question about how much deforestation might be permitted, again, there's kind of two parts to that question. The first is deforestation ever permissible within the context of deforestation-free sourcing? And the answer to that is, for the most part, no, but considering that agriculture is a complex activity, sometimes, for instance, farm infrastructure might need to be extended in one particular area. So there's some, what I would say, de minimis exceptions that are referred to in the accountability framework. But producers are not expected to be opening up new areas of natural ecosystem for commodity production. The second part of your question is about really the detection threshold and how fine scale does monitoring need to be. In that regard, we're not prescriptive about a specific threshold, but if a monitoring system needs to be capable of detecting any significant amount of deforestation in relation to the size of production areas. So, for instance, if you're working with a resolution with a 10 hectare pixel size, that's probably not going to be sufficient for deforestation monitoring. Should I pass it over to you, Sarah, to answer whether the definition, deforestation definition, is included in the methodology at all?
Thank you. And I guess the first part of my answer is very easy, because we completely align with the accountability framework's definitions for deforestation. So thanks, Jeff, for going through those. And then, so we don't collect in our assessment methodology whether the company does define deforestation in their commitments, but completely align with the accountability framework that is required. There are some things that we don't currently look for and assess at the moment where no companies currently do that. So yeah, it's something that we may add in the future, but would definitely push for companies to be clear, what definition are they using and is it aligned with the accountability framework. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Emma, just a couple of sort of questions to you. One, someone wants to know how they would know who within their company has been contacted or been emailed the survey, and the other question is it possible to see the historic scores that their company may have had, and the sort of more detailed scoring for them?
Yeah, absolutely. So we email as many companies as we have contact information for. For some, that is through direct emails, but to others it is through kind of generic email addresses for the sustainability team, or an email inbox like that. If you do have a specific question on who it is that we've contacted, if you would like to email us at forest500@globalcanopy.org, then we will get back to you as soon as we can with who it is that we've notified. And if you want us to update that email address so that someone else is notified, we can do that. And in terms of having access to the detail of your last score, all of our assessments are publicly available on forest500.org already. If you search there's a search bar on the right-hand side. If you search your company name, you will then be able to click through and see your assessment for at least the previous 2 years. And if you've been in the Forest 500 since 2014 or for a number of years, you'll be able to go back and view your assessment from each of those years as well.
Great, thank you, Emma. Sarah, there's a question for you from Dennis Popov. If a company sources materials from deforestation-free regions, would it mean that the boldness of its commitments will be lower and therefore the ranking will also be reduced?
Thanks, Josh. It's an interesting question. So if a company sources solely from non-tropical regions, then they actually wouldn't be selected in the Forest 500 because they then don't have that influence and that exposure in the supply chains that we're looking at. However, for those companies that are already in those supply chains, we do not advocate that they simply remove their sourcing elsewhere, because that really doesn't solve the problem. We really encourage companies to engage with the suppliers in their supply chain to drive change and support those suppliers to change their practices, rather than moving their sourcing and allowing a customer who may not have such stringent standards as you to come in and continue to source that commodity. And globally, we're not solving that problem.
That's great, thank you. And another question that's come in, which I think we probably answered actually, but there's a question is, does the Forest 500 team send out a preliminary assessment to companies to review and provide feedback on ahead of, so they can point out where maybe there's missing information or something like that that is publicly available? And maybe if I put that to you, Emma.
Thank you. So we do not share a preliminary assessment. We do have a very thorough assessment methodology and assessment process that we do detail further in the assessment methodology document on our website. If once we've launched the data, there is an error in, or what you think is an error in our assessment, then you can reach out to us and we will review that again and update it if we have made a mistake. But a lot of the time, the reason that some things don't score in our methodology is because of the detail of the guidance on how we score these indicators. And so that full guidance is again available in that document. But if you do have any questions on that or queries, then please do reach out to us via email and we can get back to you on your specific question.
Great, thank you, Emma. Sarah, I think this is another one for you from Nick Spooner. So how much variation do you typically see year on year in company performance? Could you say any more precisely when in Q1 the 2023 scores are used? It could be helpful to be as early as possible for those investors integrating this information into voting policies, for instance.
Great. Yeah, I'll maybe answer the second half of that first. So we can't give a specific date at this point, but we usually publish in either January or February. And as Emma said, we will be contacting all the companies that are assessed when we finish the assessment period, and also to give a heads up of when the scores are coming out in advance. So you will be given that date. And then in terms of variation, it's a really mixed bag. There's definitely, we see general progress from some companies. We have seen in the past, significant progress happening in just 1 year at a big companies stepping up and doing a lot and implementing a lot in 1 year. But unfortunately, we also have many companies that continue to score 0 or have set commitments back in 2014 that they haven't then revisited or reported against and are kind of stagnating. So it is really varied. As Emma said, you can look on our website and look back at historic assessments if you are interested in seeing how companies have progressed over time. So you can do that on forest500.org.
Fantastic, thank you, Sarah. And Emma, this is one from you. It's from Nina Lenga. So as you assess companies, do you see a difference in interpretation of deforestation, labour rights, etc., between companies? And does that feed at all into how you rate a company?
This ties really well into the question that Jeff and Sarah answered earlier around the definitions of deforestation. We do see some variation, but more in terms of conversion and when it's conversion and deforestation. But because the Forest 500 is assessing against best practice and against the best practice and definitions of the accountability framework, we use those definitions and apply that to the commitment or the information that the company has published, and then apply that to our scoring methodology. So even if there is variation in how things are, on how those things are defined by the company, it is how they are defined in relation to our guidance and the definitions of the accountability framework that factors in to how they score in our assessments.
That's great. Thank you very much, Emma. I'm conscious of time, actually. We've had a great flood of questions. Thank you for everyone that's put those in there. I mean, I think also if we can possibly follow up on other questions that have come in after the webinar too, if we haven't managed to cover them today. But I think it just ends up with me saying a huge thank you to Jeff and Sarah and Emma for your contributions today. It was brilliant, really informative. I think for me, someone who's quite new into the space, what's really exciting is starting to understand more about how deforestation is about biodiversity, but it's also about climate change. It's also about human rights, and just that getting that wider picture is really, really valuable. So I'd just like to say thank you to everyone for joining us, for all your questions. As you say, recording the webinar will be shared with you soon, including links to the 2022 methodology. The next webinar is specifically for looking at the financial institutions methodology, which I think will be next week. So we'd appreciate it if you could fill up a complete quick survey, which will appear in your browser when you leave the webinar. But it just finishes up to say thank you to the panel, thank you to everyone that's joined us today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
And thank you to Josh. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.